Right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this joint program between the New England and Philadelphia chapters of NACD. Before we get started, I did want to acknowledge the recent passing of one of our NACD colleagues, Trish Ulrich, who's the former chair of the New Jersey chapter and a friend of many of ours. Recently passed, and just wanted to pass on our condolences to her friends and family. Trish was a friend of many of ours and a colleague during our NACD service, so we all mourn her passing and share our condolences. So with that, just jumping right into today's program, I think we've got a great topic, really intended to be a look back and a look forward at events of the past proxy season and their implications as we move forward. And we've got a great panel that we'll introduce in just a moment. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, a reminder to remain muted throughout the program and to use the chat function to pose questions. No need to wait until the Q&A portion at the end to submit questions. We'll monitor the chat box throughout and intersperse the questions as they come up. Next, we know that many of you want to receive credits for this program. To receive credit, we just want you to have your first and last name in your screen name in the Zoom window so that we can give you appropriate credit. And then finally, the panelists and moderator statements and opinions today are their own and not reflective of the companies for which they serve. So I'd be remiss if we didn't thank all of our sponsors for both the New England and Philadelphia chapters. The continued loyalty of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD. It's their support that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric local programming and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that's vital in advancing excellence in the boardroom. Today, we're highlighting two very special spotlight sponsors, Morgan Lewis and Pay Governance, who have continued to support our mission of excellent corporate governance. Thank you both for your support. Okay. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Gloria Larson. Gloria is a lawyer, public policy expert, and respected Boston business leader. Without further ado, here's Gloria.
Thank you so much, Glenn. And I'm delighted to see so many colleagues from Greater Boston, as well as our Philadelphia friends. I've just lost light where I am. So if you'll excuse me for a second, I'm going to be turning on the lights in this room. But we have two really terrific panelists who will be joining us. Matt Giuseppe, who is from PwC's Proxy and Broader Government Resource Center. And we have Brian Kegery, who is a partner at Morgan Lewis, and where he specializes in corporate representation, including proxy season work. So before we get started on questions, I'm going to turn to Matt, who I know has a couple of high-level slides for us to see, so we can look at the overarching vote results, as well as some of the trends that I think we can consider when we're talking about the 25 proxy season 2. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you to show those slides, and then we can do a much deeper dive into some of these specific areas.
Thanks, Gloria, and I'll pull this up on the screen while you get the lights going there. Good morning, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know, I am a little bit of a governance nerd, and so I'm always happy to join and talk about proxy season and sort of what we've seen and unpack what's behind the numbers. And the numbers certainly are important just because we've seen a lot of shifting over the course of really the last, I'd say 5 to 7 years, but this year I think saw a lot of the trends that we had seen emerging going into the 22 proxy season really take hold. The first is that shareholder proposals seem to continue to be a very active space where there are a range of different investor types that are submitting proposals, engaging with companies around them, and I think frequently withdrawing proposals. And So if you look sort of at the top of this screen in terms of the shareholder proposals, we don't just look at the proposals and proxy statements with the 585 definitely being a retraction a little bit from last year's peak, right, of nearly 650. But also the proposals that are being announced either publicly or through other means, as well as through the no action process, and seeing that settlements definitely ticked up a little bit this year in terms of driving the shareholder proposal process, which means that companies are able to reach agreement on what I would say are the more reasonable shareholder proposals that are filed. And then those where there tends to be irreconcilable differences or some other concerns will show up on the ballot and go to a vote. In the bottom of this slide, you will see that the trend of environmental and social topics driving the shareholder proposal landscape has really set in. If you go back to 2021, you'll see that there's a little more balance between the E&S and governance, but it really has sort of looked like E&S proposals are the term, but we'll see in a moment the makeup of those proposals has changed with the quote-unquote anti-ESG proposal count increasing significantly. So with a quick look at how things played out, I'll highlight sort of 2 or 3 important factors about the numbers here. The first is on the left with those governance proposals. Support definitely ticked back up. Some of that was the nature of the proposals in terms of the topics that they were addressing, especially from some of the more prolific shareholder proposal filers, returning to sort of core governance issues. As well as sort of targeting those proposals at companies where there's an opportunity for improvement. This year we actually split that middle box. Normally you talk about E&S proposals sort of collectively, but I think it's actually important to think about sort of the topic area and what's being asked of companies. I don't love the pro and anti monikers. I think it's to some degree 2 sides of the same coin. But there are proposals that are asking companies to take proactive actions around, environmental and social issues, and proposals asking companies to consider whether their actions to date have, really been linked to long-term value creation. What you'll see in both cases is that support for these proposals has fallen significantly from the peak, as well as the number of proposals passing, especially on the left side of that middle box, has fallen drastically. We're going to get into that, so I'm not going to preview sort of what I think is driving that and take away some of Gloria's thunder and my conversation with Brian, but it definitely is a trend that's worth understanding and thinking about. Finally, everybody focuses on shareholder proposals, but there's more on the ballot than shareholder proposals. And quite frankly, most companies don't have a shareholder proposal on their ballot. So it's important to pay attention to both the say on pay and director support, which every company generally does have there. The say on pay trend, you have seen support come back to sort of pre-pandemic, sort of early say on pay days. There are a number of things driving that I know Brian's going to go into significantly. One of the things that, even though there are only small changes in the average support numbers that you see there has been a significant drop in the number of groups. So that would almost, point to the movement in the large numbers is having a really large and significant impact as it sort of pulls through down to the bottom. And the same is true for director votes. Again, every time I publish these paper and we sort of look at it, our compliance team and risk team says, really, Matt, there's a significant change between 95% support and 96%. But when you think about the number of directors that are elected global in the US every year, those small changes in averages actually do pull through pretty significantly in terms of shrinking levels of directors that receive below sort of that 90% support level. And while that had been expanding for the past couple of years, this year, we did see shareholders registering their concerns with board members, yourselves, a little less frequently. And I know we're going to delve into that topic as well. So Gloria, I hope that sets us up for a really great conversation. And I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue around this. Oh, you're muted, Gloria.
Thank you. And that's just a reminder to everyone else too, to please keep your mics muted. Could hear a little background noise. So Matt's slides will be sent to everyone. And I also want to point out that the always much awaited report out of the Governance Insight Center at PwC we'll be sending to your inboxes for everyone who's registered. So thanks for that overview. It's exactly what we needed, both sort of an overview of the vote results as well as some of the trends that are emerging. So speaking of which, Brian, I do want to turn really immediately to the votes for what were really pretty resounding impact, I thought, for Say on Pay. I mean, their directors should be pretty darn happy about what happened this year. All of us were sort of, for the most part, not only getting these, higher level, back to the past levels of support after some declines in the past. And very few proposals were actually directors failing to receive majority support. So low numbers at the low side and high numbers at the other end. What's going on? Do they love us? Do the investors love us?
I think they do. I think that's what it is. It's just fantastic directors. As with anything, I think there's a lot of factors that weigh in here. From a macro level, I think it's pretty commonly seen that when your share price is going up, when the market's going well, investors are generally happier and they're willing to see a bit higher compensation, and they're happier with the compensation when they're also making money on their investment. And we've had a couple of years of not amazing returns, but the market's been doing well, sort of against all odds. So I feel like that's a part of it. From a more focused level, though, I do feel that companies and boards are getting better at disclosing what investors really want to know. People have been having these conversations with their investors long enough that they start to understand that, hey, this is what people really want to see in our proxy and our CDNA, to really explain to them what the comp committee was thinking when they were approving these numbers, because the numbers by themselves can sometimes be eye-watering, but when you break it down and you say, here are the specific things that the board wanted the executive team to accomplish this year, which drives shareholder value, which helps everybody, do better at the end. I think that's a large part of it. A third trend is we're seeing the ISS Glass Lewis folks, they're taking less of a maybe it's not less of a stringent view on Say on Pay, but they're, from what we're seeing, recommending against more or less frequently. Now, the flip side of that coin is we are seeing more recommendations against chairs of comp committees. That's sort of been the shift here, is don't vote against Say on Pay. Let the chair of the comp committee, that's how you're going to shock them, is if you all vote against this one director, that's how you're going to get movement. So I've seen that shift a little bit as well.
Do you think this is going to provide additional latitude for companies going forward when they think about their design for CEO comp? Or is it because the disclosures are good, people are getting the information they want? Yeah, if they're unhappy with something, they've got more granular information so they can vote against a particular comp chair. But does this, in some ways, if you maintain that level of transparency, does this give you an opportunity to think about design, even with some complications in tough years, through shareholder engagement, things like that, that would allow you to get past some of the sticky wicket things?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't take this year's results as a golden ticket next year to approve off the wall compensation, or here's that holdback bonus you've been thinking about, and now's the time to give the huge discretionary one-time bonus out, just so everyone's happy. That, I wouldn't say that gives boards that mandate. I will say that it does allow a bit more flexibility to do a bit more bespoke compensation arrangements that the comp committee maybe was thinking about, but said, hey, let's keep our heads down this year. Let's not do anything that we haven't done in the past. So I'd say as long as you're keeping it within the lanes and you're disclosing it well, that I think being an SEC disclosure lawyer, that's what I always preach is disclose, and explain. You can disclose it, but also explain what you're thinking and why you're doing it. So if you want to move to a bit more, on the forefront of compensation, that's probably fine as long as you continue up the very good level of disclosure and you're making sure that you're speaking with your investors and when you're doing what you should be doing, which we're going to use the outreach how many times during this next 45 minutes? I'm going to guess 200. As long as you keep up the outreach and you're speaking with your investors and you're letting them know what you're thinking and you're listening to their thoughts, I think it should be fine.
But what are you seeing with respect, particularly as we think of the road ahead? I'm hearing mixed results about including ESG metrics in comp. I mean, it's a bit of a sort of a divide. And is that a bad idea?
I think, well, I never want to say it's a bad idea. If the comp committee wants to do it, it's something that can be done. It's certainly dangerous because you're now stepping into two different potential risk areas where, generally investors will agree that if you're tying your CEO's comp to TSR, to your shareholder return, everyone likes when that goes up. If you're tying their compensation to ESG metrics, some folks may disagree that they shouldn't be receiving anything like that at all. So it is certainly risky. Matt will touch a little bit more on where we're seeing ESG going and the trends we're seeing there, but there's certainly additional risk to it, but I don't think it's such a third rail that it can't be done.
Matt, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I was just going to add on that too, because I think sometimes you can talk about ESG metrics and you can be thinking about sort of what I would call sort of the ancillary topics that, the board or company might be touching, that you would almost like put them in there because you felt like you were checking a box. And I think Brian is spot on that, that can be a very tricky dynamic and something that, might be disconnected from tying compensation to the issues that are connected to value creation versus some of those areas. People will say safety is an ESG topic, right? But there are plenty of companies where safety is core to the company's ability to be successful, to deliver value and to meet its objectives. And it's totally appropriate for safety to be a compensation metric for executives because it's so fundamental to the business. Right.
Would
so
labor,
I try to, what?
Sorry, I was going to say, would you add labor to that as well?
Labor, yeah, talent may be one where, in labor and sort of there, you can think about really if you sort of everyone who's on the call today could probably sit in their chair and think about a topic that you've been talking about for their entire board service, regardless of whether or not ESG was a topic area that sort of came up that falls under that umbrella. And so I think it really is about separating out the two topics and really thinking about what's important for the business, for executive incentives and communication to the market versus what you might be doing. I think Brian alluded to from the more sort of, we feel like we should do this type stuff, which that's not really what you should be doing with compensation, right?
So I'd love to turn, since I opened the door to ESG, I'd love to turn to the trends that you saw. And Matt, I'm going to start with E&S. I'd love to start with environment. I'd love to think a little bit about where we are with proposals around climate and energy transition and other kinds of things where you have growing both EU, US. I know the SEC rules have been stayed in the court, but you've got the California climate stuff. Sort of how are investors thinking about the regulatory construct and what is now being required of companies to disclose? And is that playing a role? Because the numbers are low in terms of support.
Yeah, I think it really is something that you need to bring some nuance to around sort of understanding what fits under those top line numbers. And because I think while there is a lot of regulatory action and companies are working very hard to get ready for their required disclosures under, as you mentioned, CSRD, California, Australia, sort of, you can pretty much name a country today and see sort of a trend coming there in terms of that disclosure requirement. but it's also really hard for the investor community to anticipate how they might use information, right, without having that chance to see the overall market dynamics and really do that comparison, right? I think about back when I was wearing my investor hat, and we were all hammering for that, clear, comparable, consistent data that's high quality, right? And we seem to be moving very quickly from that, and there is a ton of energy behind that, in the corporate clients that I speak to. In the investor community, they're looking at sort of where they are today and what they have today. And I think what they're seeing, especially around environmental and social issues, is companies have spent, especially in the proxy and sort of otherwise, a lot of effort to improve disclosures around, what are the risks that the company faces and how are they managing and thinking about those risks. And some of that is definitely falling through to the votes on the shareholder proposals, where you can see that it's not just sort of what the proposal is asking for necessarily as a net new disclosure item or specific topic area, but it appears from dialogue and as well as the voting that investors are looking at the topic area that's being addressed by the proposal, whether or not this is actually I waffle between material or important, right? So let's call it a very important risk for the company to be able to manage, for the disclosure lawyers on the call today. And how well the company has disclosed the way that it is thinking about that risk and managing it, up and through the board level. And that disclosure has drastically improved. And one of the nice things about the shareholder proposal process is you tend to see the same shareholder proposal filed at multiple companies, sometimes with only the name of the company changed, right? So you can sort of do a little A/B comparison and try to, with the aside for the, different makeup of the shareholder base, try to understand what's driving the decision. And especially around climate proposals, it really does look like it's the disclosure that is the, responsible for at least 10, maybe even 20% of the vote outcome. And I think that's also true. And I don't want to sort of get too far into ENS without also sort of touching. That's also true on the compensation side of things, right? Brian talked about sort of the transparency and those sorts of things, but there's also that additional disclosure around the pay for performance chart, right? That is starting to become more meaningful, as well as, information around the clawback policies that companies are adopting. So this isn't just an ENS trend. I think it's something that we're going to hit on a lot, which is, the disclosure and transparency matters. Oh, I think you might have hit the mute button again. But while Gloria gets to that, I do think that it is something where the other thing that comes up and is inherent, Brian, I know you see this, right? It's not universal, right? You do have to look at the sector specific when you're thinking about what are the most important topics that a company has to address, right?
For sure. I mean, and the board, I think, knows generally what its investors are most focused on and most concerned with. It's the things that take up most of the board meeting, the issues there. So the things that keep board members up all night are the things that also keep investors up all night. So addressing those issues with your stockholders in the proxy or through meetings is absolutely, it's a requirement these days.
So Matt, while my faulty mute button was not cooperating, I was trying to get a little bit into the social side, particularly in an election year. What did we see? It seemed to be that we saw an awful lot of proposals about expenditures on lobbying and political issues, but that didn't gain much traction. So as we head into 25, we'll at least be past the election cycle, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those issues have gone away. What are you thinking about in terms of low support, but they're still there. And I would also love your comments on DEI, because I wonder if that's kind of a tale of two cities where, yes, there's a lot of happiness on the part of investors in seeing the EEO1 and even more granular discussions around success and progress there. And at the same time, as we know, through states attorney generals and the courts, we're also seeing some pushback and a bit of a chill, I guess, for some companies in thinking about it. So sort of two parts of the S of social.
Yeah, and I'll start with the political and civic activity related proposals, which we have definitely seen a trend down in terms of support, right? It peaked in 21 at about 42%, and it's down to about 20% this year. With having, and you would think in a year where there is a significant political activity, investors would be interested in seeing more information around that. But I think that goes back to that topic that we've sort of seen as a thread throughout the conversation around disclosure around political and civic activities has increased significantly over the past decade. It is something that investors have been focusing on in terms of filing proposals. It almost fit into some of the cleanup activity, if you will. If you remember sort of thinking back to when majority voting was a hot topic for director elections, and Cal Stirs, would file 100 proposals a year with the interest of just sort of being the catalyst for change, right? And then they went to just writing a letter because that was enough for a catalyst of change. I think a lot of companies, especially those that are larger, have thought through sort of the way that they're going to engage in the political environment and the way that they're going to tell shareholders about that engagement. And so there isn't necessarily a lack of disclosure that would trigger some of the largest investors to support a proposal, right? There's certainly going to be a block of investors that have a voting guideline that's sort of, if it says politics, we're voting for it, right? But the way that you get from 20 to 40 or even passing is you have a proposal where the topic is important to the company and the company's disclosures are lacking, right? And so I think that's especially in this environment, that really drives home that concept of the disclosure mattering. Brian, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that side.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and you said it before I could, is that even though there are not as many proposals being filed or passing, several of my clients are receiving letters asking them about their political activities, asking them about their disclosures. Is there anything you feel like you should disclose? Yeah, so it's certainly still, I would say, towards the forefront of concerns and things that boards are hearing about and being asked about. But, and I can't speak for what investors are thinking, but if I'm guessing, they're finding that they're gaining enough traction through these letters without going through the proposal process that they can avoid that whole technical process and just send in a letter. And it's seeming most boards are willing to respond either directly or through their additional proxy disclosures. And it's still something that's on people's mind, but it may have shifted battlegrounds from proposals to simply letters.
What do you think about DEI?
Yeah, and I think on the DEI side as well, I think you're right to call it sort of the tale of two cities, if you will. Right. I don't know that there is a single individual on the call that would say talent is not important to the success of their business. Right. And if you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and especially that inclusion side of things, we know from research and experience and our lived lives that there are elements around sort of the way that you interact with your coworkers and peers and those sorts of things that contribute to employee satisfaction. And we know that employee satisfaction and engagement are definitely contributing to the long-term success of an organization. And I don't think that there's anyone out there that's suggesting that we need to have a more combative or less engaged workforce, right? But there's definitely, as there is with the term ESG versus sustainability, there's definitely a discussion around the margins around, what some of the, less core material and topics to that sort of element that might, bring concerns or where there might be, deep differences of opinions where you start to lose some of that engagement value when you go into those topic areas. And I think that's sort of the discussion that you're seeing and that I'm hearing in boardrooms is, how do we, understand sort of what is a issue that creates, that could create some of that tension versus how do we think about engaging our workforce in a way that, leads to the value, the creation that comes with having folks that are, really desire to work with a company, are with a company that they believe aligns with their vision for the world and can, contribute in that way and develop that value proposition.
You suggested a couple of minutes ago that the idea of the anti or con ESG, ENS, is, a bit of, it's a more complex area than just saying it's the anti, the anti-woke backlash. It's not necessarily that. And it's very low level of support for those proposals, 2%. So it's not going anywhere, but there were a lot of proposals and it's a mixed bag apparently. And sort of, I'm wondering how that sorts out. The statistic that I thought was interesting was that even though there's not, maybe because of the granularity of all the disclosures and shareholder engagement around E&S, before we get to G, that there is, widespread discussion in proxies and with engagement with your main investors around those issues. So, but that 94% in one survey I saw said that of investors said that they would continue to focus as much, if not more, on environmental and social matters than they have in prior years. So it's not as if the major investments, certainly the big asset managers, have backed away from any of this. It's just not necessarily at the earlier end several years ago where they felt the need to sort of point out, maybe, am I getting this right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the changing dynamic of shareholder proposals necessitating, as a catalyst for these discussions. Brian mentioned it, there are letters, there's dialogue. I sometimes sit back and need to reflect, right? If you think about the engagement environment that we're in currently, right? It feels like it's been the way we've been doing business all along, right? But it really comes out of, the Dodd-Frank bill, mandatory say on pay less than 15 years ago. And for anyone who was involved in engagement conversations back then, it could look like an hour-long conversation around the compensation program, right? So when you think about sort of the dialogue between shareholders and companies around these, more broad topic areas, it's even less than that. It's maybe 10 years old that we've been sort of in the current paradigm and we're sorting things out, right? The shareholder proposals that are, as I said at the beginning, that make it onto the ballot are necessarily the ones where the company and the shareholder weren't able to reach an agreement prior to the proxy being filed, right? Or a topic area where there's a true difference of opinion, and we'll get to that on activism. We're seeing that too, and so it can look like there's more of an antagonistic environment than there is, just by nature of what the light gets shined on, right? It gets shined on this element of where there's disagreement versus all of the areas where there is agreement. And Brian, you've seen this, right? Disclosure has exploded. Right. So there is agreement on a lot of areas where there's value to be sharing information around this. And, what we sort of can get stuck on in proxy season is the area where there's still some disagreement.
That sounds exactly right. And I keep seeing so much more narrative too, the telling of your story, in addition to required, explicit disclosure language, but getting better and better at sharing why we're all doing what we're doing. So, Brian, what was different this year, E&S trending down or stabilizing sort of at this low level of support? It didn't happen with governance proposals. It kind of feels like we're back to traditional shareholder behavior in bringing up some of these issues that in the past were sort of just bread and butter things that you would see, but took maybe a back seat for a while. And obviously, a couple of these sort of drove the numbers, but it was a lower number of proposals, but support for elimination of supermajority voting, of also the 60% number for at least one of the others. I think classified boards and some of the other things, action by written consent got above 30, and that's pretty much 30% you're the expert, but that feels like that's when boards start to really pay attention to what's going on. So what do you make with your clients out of this governance season? And if you could talk just for a few minutes about then where does that take us into this next proxy season?
For sure. And I definitely, my personal experience mirrored the larger numbers. We did see a lot more of the, I don't want to say garden variety, but the typical governance points that had maybe taken a back seat in recent years with the rise of ESG and DEI and some of the more, I don't know how, the newer trend of issues that were grabbing investors, thoughts and proposals and letters. So certainly seeing a lot of our clients that have classified boards or supermajority voting or combined CEO chair roles receiving letters, and investors are starting to ask their questions and are starting to, if they aren't going full proposal this year, I think that's going to continue on in coming years. I feel that the larger companies are usually at the forefront of these. They're the ones that are getting the proposals first, whereas the smaller companies start to receive the letters, and if they're refusing to act, that's when the larger wave of proposals comes, I feel. So I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see this trend next year, where companies that have received the letters saying, please declassify your board, or please do these other fairly standard governance points. If they haven't done it, then we could see a larger wave of actual proposals next year, say from the or not even activists, just from general corporate governance, shops saying, we tried to play nice last year, you froze us out, so this year we're going with the proposal.
Is that kind of where the proxy advisory firms are? Are they returning to sort of this more standard issue? I don't, maybe overstating that, but shareholder friendly proposals.
I'm not sure if I'd ever say they moved away from supporting those. I think
I agree.
generally made their views clear on I guess classified board is the first thing that jumps to mind, but they've always made clear that they don't love that, or God forbid, if you're a public company that has permits shareholder written action by shareholder written consent, if you try to remove that, they'll both come down on you pretty hard. So it's I'm seeing more investor interest, and while Glass Lewis and ISS have not necessarily changed their thinking, I think it becomes more magnified when there's more attention paid to it. So the more proposals, that's when it comes up. I didn't see in the past ISS or Glass Lewis say recommending against a board because they have a classified board, but if there's a proposal for it, I do see that coming up more.
Gloria, if I could interrupt.
Sure, please.
And we had some questions. I think some people on the call don't know what a classified board is, so maybe you could take 1 minute.
Perfect. Thank you.
Provide that as background. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
For sure. So a classified board, put most simply, is a board that's divided into typically 3 groups. So to make everyone's math easy early in the morning, let's say you have 9 directors. You would have 3 in class 1, 3 in class 2, 3 in class 3. And only 1 class is up for election every year. So in 2025, your class 1 directors, just those 3 are up for election. The other 2 classes are not up for election, and therefore it's typically seen as a defense against a takeover attempt or a proxy fight, where even if the activist is able to win that vote, they still only have 1/3 of your board. So it makes the process much longer. And it's depending on which side of the coin you fall on, activist defense or shareholder activism is either a good thing or a bad thing. And I will not get into that on this call for sure. But that, at the end of the day, that's the simplest way, is yes, only a portion of your board is up for election every year.
I'll add, like, a synonym is annual director elections. So sometimes you hear about it referred to that way as well, which is whether or not you are elected for a 1-year term or a 3-year term.
Do you just quickly, do you know the percentage that are now just annual elections of the full board? Because I feel like a lot of this got dealt with some time ago, and I just don't know. Maybe that was just my boards to annual elections for everybody.
I don't have the statistics to hand. I will say my understanding is it is probably a super majority of S&P 500 companies. It becomes a lot more common as you move down from the largest companies for two reasons. One, Brian mentioned this, the large companies are the ones that get the most attention, just given their makeup in the portfolio of the largest investors and even the smallest ones. But also some of the governance practices that would be treated as best practice for a large company, like annual director elections, like not having a super majority vote requirement or those types of elements, are really appropriate for a company in that stage of its growth. But as a smaller company is entering into its growth cycle or sort of going through a transition or some things like that, there may be governance practices that are most appropriate for it at that stage in its development. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about sort of the return to the governance proposals is, again, you can ask your advisors, unlike E&S, where you can, benchmarking can be really hard and sort of it can feel a little opaque. And what are you really talking about? On the governance side of things, you can ask your advisors to benchmark your practices relative to sort of these standard expectations. And then make informed decisions about whether or not that structure is appropriate for your company at its given time. And I think that's really the takeaway from this, right? Is if you can't make the case for what you're doing and why you're doing it, we're coming back to that transparency over and over again here, right? Then it becomes harder if a shareholder proposal or letter comes to your desk to be able to sort of rebuke it or push back.
I think
if I may,
point's terrific. Yeah.
If I may add just one thing is, these things are cyclical. There was this same, push a handful of years ago. A lot of companies changed, and most of the large companies have already enacted those. And since then, and a lot of companies rising up the ranks and a lot of IPOs recently. But since this was a hot button topic, a lot of new companies have risen to the fore. So I think it's this next class of companies that are receiving these types of proposals, and they've gotten away with having a classified board for the past decade, and there's been very little pushback on it. But now that it's coming back around, it's those companies that were not on anyone's radar 10 years ago that are now receiving these types of questions. I know for example, most biotechs that we take public start off with a classified board because you're much more at risk when you're a pre-revenue phase 3 biotech than when you're, a multi-billion-dollar, international powerhouse.
I love that. Like, governance is a living organism that you need to revisit and feed and consider on an ongoing basis, right? It's not a fixed set of rules that you follow.
It just felt for a little bit of time the E&S were dominant, and that this was kind of the left behind category, but it's always been there. To both of your points, that's all really good advice. So I want to make sure we get to a couple of other topics, and one of them is activism. Before we do, just if you have a couple of comments on the great support for director elections this year with respect to transparency, candor there, with the competency matrices and things like that are more information about leadership roles, committee leadership, those kinds of things, and where we are in terms of where your thinking is in terms of how it feels like the movement to more attention on board conduct and how the board is overseeing the operations and the strategy, that it comes down now to more granular information about who's on the board and what they're doing. So if you could just offer a couple of comments about what you think are best practices in that area, I think that would be helpful.
I do think there are some emerging best practices in that area around, you sort of hit a lot of them. The board matrix, skills matrix, talking about competencies of the individual directors and sort of what they bring to to the board relative to the company's strategy, right? And making that connection for the investor community, as well as, exposing more information around, I think, Brian, you mentioned this, when you engage with your shareholders, what have you heard and what have you done with that business? Or how do you go and use the board evaluation process as a form of continuous improvement? And I do believe that increased disclosure is translating into more support for directors. Like I said, at the onset, it looks marginal, but it's actually pretty significant in terms of the change in that support level. I'm going to make a plug here for a survey that we're going to be releasing next week. We did a survey of stewardship professionals where the folks who do the proxy voting and engaging, asking them about a range of very interesting topics, one of which was disclosure on the board and the way that the board works. And I'll offer the preview and say there was a lot of somewhat satisfied and satisfied, but not a lot of very satisfied when it comes to the overall disclosures around sort of the board and its function. So I think it's a recognition that there has been improvement. It is going in the right direction, but there's also opportunity for continued improvement. And I come back to and have a lot of conversations with boards around this concept of it's not just putting information out there, but it's putting information out there in the context of the strategy and the company and sort of connecting and drawing those lines. We like to think that investors have all the time in the world to spend looking at our specific company, but they are, understaffed relative to the volume of work that they have to do. And so the more time you can do making those connections explicit, the better it will be for all parties involved.
So it feels like the thoughts about directors' individual and board-wide responsibilities and accountability leads us into activism. And what was sort of really driving all of that this particular proxy season, and as we go into the next one, sort of what were the leading issues, but also what's been the impact. Remember, we predicted that universal proxy would drive, the proxy card would drive things in a very public way with more proxy contests, and that just hasn't happened. It's been over the last two sessions, it looks like things are still happening. Activists are still there. If anything, that's been rising level of activism to pre-COVID levels. But so what are you seeing? What's happening rather than using the proxy card itself? We're not getting to that point. The threat's there, but we're not getting there.
Yeah, Brian, I don't know. Do you want to start with sort of what you're seeing and I'll fill back in?
That'd be great.
Sure. So yeah, interestingly, we're seeing more of these issues getting settled than going to the full fight. So, and I can't speak directly, but it feels that the existence of the universal proxy card opens more of a dialogue because it's a little bit easier for both sides to get out there and get in front of shareholders, and you're putting your slate out on the same card. So that might be opening the dialogue more and allowing for companies and activists to sit down at the table and hash out their differences. And it's sort of the threat of needing to use the universal proxy card actually avoids the use of the universal proxy card. So we haven't seen a lot more actual proxy fights, but we have seen more, reaching across, the aisle, as it were, and more activists getting spots on the board. Matt, I'm not sure if that matches.
So Matt, that sounds like it's also changing company behavior too. Like when you think like an activist, what are you recommending to?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of the changing of company behavior. And I'll talk about one of the indirect impacts that I think is really important. We've talked already about increased disclosure, increase in transparency. We just talked about sort of around the functioning of the board. A lot of that increased disclosure is because of the company is thinking like an activist and trying to make sure that the information is available and out there proactively, so it doesn't look like you're being responsive when someone does take a position. And so I think you're right that there's been an overall increase in the quality of information in the market, just on the anticipation that universal proxy could have a impact and change the nature of contested elections. And we did also see an increase in settlement, like Brian said, as a result of, again, uncertainty, right? A settlement is certainty. No one really likes uncertainty in business. And so it's hard to sort of take things to the mat and go all the way to the fight when you feel like there's a reasonable discussion. And, one of the things that sometimes gets glossed over is the activists are also, I think, doing a better job of bringing well-qualified directors to the table as potential candidates to join the board, rather than necessarily just their PMs or employees. And so that also helps sort of the settlement discussion in terms of it being about, long-term success of the company, not an individual's specific objective or goal or strategy. When things do go to a fight, at least this year, where we saw a significant increase in the number of fights, kicking off with a big one that received a lot of headlines at the start of the season, activists are actually not winning board seats through proxy fights. So there's almost some incentive to settle ahead of time for them as well. We have a great data provider in Proxy Analytics who shared that 14 of 16 proxy fights, the way that they sort of track them, actually resulted in the activists winning 0 seats. Right. So, it really does point to this idea that when there are irreconcilable differences between management and the activists, it tends to at least point towards management having a pretty strong idea about, and the board about sort of what will be in their company's best interest long term. And that's a little bit unsurprising given the information asymmetry that exists between what management and the board has versus what exists in the public, right, sphere. But I think it does point towards this idea that there can be an opportunity to find common ground. I will say, though, we saw this trend back in 2017 and a little bit before that, where it felt like, it was settlement first, fight second, and settle fast. And there were some investors that raised concerns that boards were thinking short term in terms of those settlements and trying to avoid the fight. And so I think it is important, if and when this situation arises for you, that you do consider how you're going to communicate and be transparent with the market about both sort of, what happened in the near term, but how you've maintained that long-term focus that so many investors are, very articulate about being important to them.
Yeah,
So,
Matt, if I can.
do you
I'm
want
sorry,
to
I'm just going to echo one point,
Yeah.
Matt, that you just made, which I completely agree with, is when these activist campaigns do come up and boards are taking a look at them, the boards or the times that I'm really seeing the board dig in and say, no, absolutely not, we're going to go to the mat, is when the board, feels very comfortable that they're correct here, when they feel that it's someone that just wants to, do something to the company, not for the best interest of the company, but for themselves. They want the company to load up on debt and dividend a bunch of cash. And they feel this is not for our best interest, and they're willing to really fight for it. So unless there's something that I feel the board is vehemently against, I feel like they're much more likely to speak. So that's the irreconcilable differences I feel like that you just mentioned, that's really when I'm seeing fights happen and go to the vote.
Yeah, and as board members, you can ask when you're talking about strategy, what was considered and sort of moved on from as part of the strategy setting process? Because most of these activists are not necessarily going to come up with a new idea, right? It will be probably something that was discussed at the management level, but as boards, you can be more prepared if you take the time to understand what were some of those ideas that, were sort of moved on from in the process of setting strategy. So it's not the first time you hear it.
So I know our time is short, but I want to ask you one more question as we go into the 25 season, and that's around responsible AI. I think, we saw some 20% of the, again, these are institutional investors saying, this is important to me in 24. So it feels like that number is going to grow. And I just wonder if you've got some quick comments to make about how boards should be preparing for that. Obviously, companies are using it, but where's the governance structure? Where's sort of the ethical, framework around that?
I think you hit on the most important point right there, which is understanding sort of what is the governance structure that's going to be in place to make sure that you're using AI effectively, appropriately, in an ethical manner, and address all of the concerns that come up with it, but also take advantage of all of the benefits that can be there. One of the things I think is most important for boards is to have a conversation with management on two factors. One is the education side of things, right? This is a relatively new technology, and there is not an expectation that every board member be, well experienced in sort of AI and how to use it, and what makes up a good question, and all of those sorts of things, a good prompt. But what is important is understanding how the board is getting smart on the topic so that they can provide effective oversight, right? So there's that side of things, but then there's also the element of having an open dialogue with management teams about the cadence for which they're going to come back to you and discuss sort of the way that they're managing this internally, because it's such in the news. It's a new topic. It's something everybody is interested in. You also want to make sure you understand sort of how the dialogue is going to progress, so that the management team can also get smart on the topic and understand it and have some real value additive discussion with the board, rather than sort of just providing information to the board, right? It's about, being able to have that discussion versus just sort of providing information.
Brian, you get the last word.
Oh, I think this is very similar to how cybersecurity became a big point. And 10 years ago, I bet if we looked at a survey of board agendas, cybersecurity would appear on very few of them. And now it's almost a requirement that at least once a year, maybe once a meeting, someone presents to the board cybersecurity and what's going on, and make sure the board understands it, both from just a general overall governance perspective. The board needs to understand it's a very important thing. And also, when it comes to proxy season, you want to be able to put in that proxy statement that our board is actively involved, and we have good oversight, understanding. We have, in a perfect world, we have an expert that understands this and is sort of like your audit committee financial expert. We almost have a cybersecurity or AI expert. So that's where I'm guessing AI disclosure and conversation is going to go, where if it's not on your agenda at least once a year, it needs to be, and hopefully more often, where, as Matt said, it's not only your CISO coming to you and saying, we use this much AI. It's some education, and it's an evolving discussion where the board is not expected to, get into the weeds too much and understand the various different inputs and outputs, but leading where you're going and ensuring that management and your information security team are on top of it and are making sure that you're using it to the best of the company's ability.
Oh, I can't thank you both enough. And I also think that as we walk away, this feels like, we're really talking about, even with new topics, increased transparency, disclosures, and active engagement with investors are the best shields that any company can have in terms of telling their own narrative in a way that it's well understood by the investment community. So Beth, I think I'm turning this back to you.
Sure. Thank you all. Gloria, Matt, Brian, fantastic, very informative. My name is Beth Boland. I'm the chair of the New England chapter, and we are proud to have hosted this conjunctively with the Philadelphia chapter. The programs that we both have are, I think we've got a slide on our upcoming programs, at least for both of our chapters. And please go to our websites. We have just a jam-packed program season coming up. And I see that Kristen has given us a couple of prompts for the survey. You'll also be getting an email, and we really, really hope that you will fill out that survey. We do look at them. We do take those comments into our thinking about future programs and future speakers. So we really appreciate you being here today and also filling out the survey. Thanks so much, and we'll see you at our next program.